Hi everyone, Jay here from Jade Productions, back with another video, and this week, now that time has come for the General's Handbook to be spread around, it's all available now, so we've all had chances to look through it, or most of us have, those of us who are still waiting to get our hands on our physical copies, and have to make do with our digital copies, me, and then, of course, the FAQs as well for the other factions that were missing to give their points costs and erratas and anything else for them have finally come out as well, only 2 days ago, 1 day ago for me because of time differences, but anyway, let's go over it, and I'm just going to present a quick summary of what has happened in this year's 2020 General's Handbook, just for those of you who haven't sat down with it yet, to just give you a brief indication of what it's done, and what I think the results are going to be moving forward into the next year of Age of Sigmar. So the first things first is, now that I've had a chance to look at the points costs across the board, it wasn't a huge points cost drop year. So there wasn't a huge rebalancing of stuff, which is pretty good. I think most Age of Sigmar factions are in a lot of good places. The thing being, what went down mostly was monsters and heroes, and they all went down about 20 to 30 points when you look at it. And to be fair, monsters and heroes are the things that tend to be overcosted. There's a few battle line infantry things which I saw, it's like, oh, that should have gone down, why did that not go down? And then there's other things where, in a rare instance, I actually, the Auric War Clans, for a video I just put out, a list I did is now a bit more expensive than what it was before, so it would need readjusting. But, interestingly enough, that is one of the few ones that I've seen that has had its units rebalanced in the battle line department, which is pretty good, because brutes were a little undercosted, but now I think they're a little overcosted. I think they haven't quite hit that happy medium there, and Ard Boys are very good still. They just went up like 10 points. So then you've got, but mostly it's heroes and monsters that have been affected by most of the points changes that I've looked across. And that's good because anytime those go down, it means there's more chance you'll be seeing them, because the problem with monsters in particular, and behemoths, and really big single models, is that they just get overwhelmed, and they just don't have the wounds compared to a 20-man blob of Hearthguard. You'd think that the naked dwarves would be less durable than the flying tank that is the Ironclad, but no, it's the reverse. The naked dwarves are more durable than the Iron Tank. So that's a thing. So when they come down in price, it's always a moment to celebrate. Some of them are ridiculously overcosted, but they also aren't undercosted to the point where you get people spamming them, and they can't be spammed anyway because of the behemoth caps in match play as well, making it nice and easy. Now, it does hurt, but it definitely helps factions that rely on those heavily to fill in certain niche leader roles, as well as behemoth roles. So, it's good to have that. In particular, two factions that really got great points reductions with Stormcast and Nurgle. So the Stormcast, they have an issue where a lot of their stuff is, it's one of the few factions that has been affected by power creep. It's almost like they made them underpowered at release. Like, you look at the release order of Age of Sigmar and you see the 1.5 factions, which were made with Age of Sigmar 2nd edition in mind, so Daughters of Cain, Idoneth Deepkin, Legions of Nagash, Nurgle, and you look at them and you think, okay, these are still powerful even today in 2nd edition, when we've had so many more armies released, but Stormcast, which was an actual 2nd edition release, are overcosted for what they do to an annoying amount, and they haven't fared well in terms of, well, these really old models that were, first released when Age of Sigmar first came out, their war scrolls really haven't changed much, and they've still got General's Handbook 1 costs that were good at the time, but not anymore. Not when many things are so much more efficient than Liberators. So it was good to see changes all across them. I haven't had a chance to go through the Stormcast in detail just yet. I just saw that there were a lot of changes, and I did a quick comparison, like, oh yeah, lots of things have gone down. Nurgle as well. Nurgle's not an army I play in this one, but it's not one I really see on the tabletop like ever. I've actually no events I've been to have used Nurgle. Very few tournaments that I've looked at the results have seen Nurgle in it. They tend to be overpriced and really elite lists that rely on endurance, and they can do work. They're not a bad army. They're just a little expensive for what they do. And that's just a case of their rules being a little older and how they're written. But I'm excited to see that. And now with the FAQs, we have a couple of other things gone down as well, and all over the place. But it's not a huge points change up this season, I want to say. So that's good. You can keep playing. A lot of your lists get cheaper. Potentially slot in one or two more units, depending on what you're playing. Mostly, probably just one extra unit or a command point. Or some more endless spells. In terms of general nerfs across the General's Handbook and the FAQs, the number one things that stood out are two of the most power creepiest of the creepy factions. The Ossiarch Bone Reapers, who had been ridiculously powerful since they were released because of the Petrifax Elite, have had that errated to actually completely change what the Petrifax Elite trait does, and turning it from something overpowered to just right, in my opinion. Because in the history of Age of Sigmar, it's very rare that you have anything with a armor save of 3+. That's incredibly powerful. The only things with 3+ armor save, like, they just don't exist in Age of Sigmar most of the time. It has to be an incredibly tanky behemoth. Like, even the Ironclad, until the Archanaut Ironclad, I always use the Ironclad as a great example because it's a real case of here's an awesome model with bad rules during its first incarnation in first edition, is even that only had a 4+ save. A giant honking metal skyship only had a 4+ save. Let that sink in. So, as power creepers come along and things have been rebalanced to make better for their points costs, you have units like, okay, now we can have some units with 3+. And 3+ is the maximum. There's never, and they're very few and far between in Age of Sigmar. Unlike 40k, where it's 3+ saves everywhere, in Age of Sigmar, your common save numbers are 4+ and 5+. That is where most things sit. Typically 4+ for things with heavy armor and monsters, and 5+ for things with light armor, and 6+ for things with no armor. What the Petrifax Elite did is they had the Ossiarchs, who had troops in equivalent of heavy armor with 4+ saves on their Mortek Guard, and 3+ saves on their I wouldn't say they're big monsters, on their monstrous infantry, which made them very durable by Age of Sigmar standards, and very powerful, because you got to remember, anything above Rend 2, and even Rend 2 itself, is rare in Age of Sigmar. So, AP is limited. Like, some factions barely have access to any Rend whatsoever. So against something that has a 3+ save or a 4+ save already, they're already going to be struggling and relying on weighted attacks. And what the Ossiarch Bone Reapers Petrifax Elite subfaction did is it took that to the extreme, and it gave +1 to the armor saves of everything that was Petrifax Elite. So now your basic battle line, that Mortek Guard, became a 3+ armor save. They were Space Marines in a game where there were no Space Marines. They were as durable, more durable, in fact, in their terms of just their armor save. Despite being a 1-wound model, they had a higher armor save than most monsters, and had an armor save comparable with flying tanks and the biggest of big god monsters. Like, let that sink in. And their monstrous infantry and their monsters went from a 3+ to a 2+, something practically unheard of. 2+ saves haven't been a thing in Age of Sigmar since the old Mystic Shield was reworked into reroll save rolls of 1 to prevent this from happening, because in Age of Sigmar, the moment things become too durable is the moment the balance of the game is broken. Because typically in Age of Sigmar, the balance comes from the factions of, sure, everything hits hard, but everything dies super quickly anyway. Like, you make jokes in 40k about, well, these guardsmen, something just has to breathe in their direction and they die. Well, in Age of Sigmar, that's the case for every unit, because everything hits hard potentially, and those that don't have a different purpose tactically, which is always a very important thing that they have to fulfill. But it's very much a case, because the low armor saves across the board, everything dies real quickly. Nothing is super durable, nothing is super durable with a super high damage output. Typically, those things that do are very few and far between, and very powerful, obviously. But Ossiarchs broke that. Ossiarchs broke that tremendously, and reintroduced a 2-up save into a game that hadn't had them for over a year. Actually, longer than that. So, now, they have been nerfed to change their Petrifax Elite trait from +1, giving you 3-up across the boards and 2-ups across the board, essentially, for your armor, with 6-ups to ignore damage, multiple ways to ignore multiple mortal wounds, and ways to then resurrect your models on top of that when they're instantly killed, or even resurrect models when your opponents are killed. Now, they reroll save rolls of 1, just like they had a permanent Mystic Shield cast upon them. Which means Mystic Shield is very much redundant in a Petrifax Elite army, but that's much better than what it was. Mathematically, it's an improvement. The thing is, the 3-up saves, sure, you're still a 4-up rerolling 1s, okay, so mathematically, you're doing pretty well there, especially once you factor in all your other ways that still exist, such as the ignoring damage, which has also been nerfed this General's Handbook, which I'll get to in a minute, as well as your ability to resurrect models being a death army. You're still very durable, but now it's not oppressively so. The biggest change is definitely that mostly armies don't need as much Ren to get through you. Because when they start to... Because the main counter to heavily armored armies are factions with lots of Rend. And there are very much some factions that are dedicated towards countering armored units. And they have the Rend across the board, and then there are factions that aren't. And they excel at piling on the attacks. Now, essentially, the factions that excelled against armored units before were not doing jack and shit. They were reducing, a like a 70% chance of making a save to a 50% chance of making a save. And you could spike the rolls, and then you still had so many ways to ignore it that it was just going straight back to that 70%, even higher. Once you stacked on all the different ways of Ossiarchs ignoring damage. So this is going to be a real change going forward for the Petrifax Elite. They're not going to be oppressive anymore. Now, they're going to be still a very durable faction. They still are heavily armored and durable, but factions that can bring the Rend are now going to be able to stand a chance against them, and there's going to be successful counters to them now. Before, it was really oppressively hard to pull off these counters because they could just soak so much damage. And you could see it in the tournament results of, here's 18 players going to a tournament, each of them bringing Ossiarch Bone Reapers. What are all of them playing? They're all playing Petrifax Elite. All of them. Every single one of them. So that was an obvious choice that's now been, it's a little less obvious. Now they're just okay. Personally, I've always been a fan of the Crematorians. But, that's just because I enjoy crazy exploding people. So that's a change that's happened there as well. Additionally, another change that's happened to another faction that's also been very good since its second edition release, that's been hit by the FAQs, is the Disciples of Tzeentch. Now, the Disciples of Tzeentch They had some changes that made them some very interesting gameplay. They had some very powerful stuff included in their new battle tome and their rework, but they had a problem where horrors, for their points cost, were oppressively powerful, and the fact that they are very easy to summon potentially, with Gaunt Summoners and your summoning table for, what are they called, Fate Points, they were very good. Not because they could hit very hard. They could if you buff them potentially in the right way, but even then it still wasn't great. It was still a case of, okay, well, they're still only got a 5-up save. The problem was the changes to their rules on how pink horrors split into blue horrors and then into brimstone horrors literally doubled the unit's endurance to a redonkulous amount. It meant that this unit, that was a battle line unit that was almost, well, it was a little more expensive than other units. Still is. They haven't changed that, fortunately. Had a ridiculous amount of wounds you had to get through to get rid of it. So you park a 10-man squad of pink horrors on an objective. Each of those pink horrors then has 1 wound. Sure, you kill one of those, it splits into 2 models, each with 1 wound each. And then each of those split into, and each of those 2 blue horrors then split into 1 brimstone horror each. So essentially, you were having them be, worth something like 5 wounds per model, essentially, after you account for all the splitting. So a 10-man unit was essentially 50 wounds that you had to remove. Very few things can remove that many things very fast, and most of them are literally Death Star bombs, like massive horde units that hit like trucks, the things that are absolute meta and are, wrecking balls, essentially. And every faction has a wrecking ball to some extent. Some are just more efficient than other. But 50 wounds from a 10-man unit. Now what happens when you pay the points to increase that to a 20-man unit? Now it's 100. It escalated far too much. So now what they've done is, only for summoned ones, they've reduced the amount you summon. It doesn't fix the problem, but it mitigates it enough so that they won't lose their competitiveness. And I'll be curious to see how much more horror spam. They're still a very good option because they still have those rules in place. They still have a lot of wounds for their points cost. Again, they are expensive for battle line, but they're good with that sheer number of wounds. Then we've got a case of, as we hypothesized in my previous video when they were previewing the General's Handbook a week or so ago, a few weeks actually now, before the pre-orders went up, the relics from Malign Portents are gone, and so you have no more ethereal units running around. You have no more Grith Feather Charms just giving extra movement and extra saves out just because your own relics are mediocre. No more great Aether Quartz pendants, brooch. It's a brooch. Aether Quartz brooches where potentially just CP for days, which if you're Seraphon, you're really going to be missing that one because you're a super CP reliant army. No more of that. No more of the Sword of Judgment, where you stick that on a character with 10 attacks and you're almost guaranteed to kill whatever hero you go after. Especially fun when you combine it with Skaven Vermin Lords of Corruption. No more of that. No more ethereal, unrendable 3-up, 4-up save, ignoring damage, behemoth cavalry monsters such as Terragai, Skull Kings, Ideneth. No more of that. Vampire Prince on Zombie Dragon is the full name. No more of that. Now your relics have been severely limited to, there's one from every realm in matched play that you can take. You say, if you're playing in that realm, you say that you're from that realm, and each of them, having looked through them, are very generic, very sort of, okay, I have some mediocre relics in my army. These are a very general alternative in case I just don't want to I don't want to worry about any of this complicated crap or any of the downsides that they give me. And suffice to say, they're pretty simplistic. Overall, you've got one from Akshi, which is a nice weapon, which gives you unmodified hit rolls of 6, become 2 hits. Sure, that's okay. That's okay on a character with lots of attacks. That's, like, these aren't bad relics. They're just very, very generic. So they don't have the kind of ridiculous factor of, I'm gonna just make that unit a ghost. Because! Or, I'm gonna potentially get infinite command points if I keep spiking rolls. Or, I'm just gonna decapitate your heroes with my sheer number of attacks. With a Sword of Judgment. You've got one from Shaman, which is a nice armor, which lets your guy ignore Rend 1. Sure. It's a nice relic. Rend 1's fairly common, depending on your armies that you're fighting. Like, Rend 1's the most easily spammable of all the Rend. So, you know, it's a little extra protection. Good on something like with a 4-up save. Again, nice and generic. In Gerb, there's the Predator's Talk, lets you reroll charges. Sure, that's fine. Reroll charges for free is pretty good for a relic. Gairan probably has the best one, I think, for monsters, which lets you heal a wound at the start of each of your hero phases. Sure. It's the Everspring Diadem, nice little tiara that you can put on your guy. I just imagine putting your Everspring put that little diadem, put that little tiara on the Lord of Blights. Let him feel pretty and actually heal some wounds. And then, you know, you got Haish, where you get another weapon that you put on one of your weapons that you have on your hero, and they get to reroll hit rolls of 1. Sure. Shaiish, they've got a thing that lets them the Gravesand Brooch. Lots of brooches. Lets them reroll save rolls of 1. Sure, that's not great, but it's something, and it's not game breaking. And then Trickster's Foil from Ulgu, which is reroll wound rolls of 1. So, you know, they're all very basic and generic, and they're not gonna be. They're a nice sort of, I don't have anything good in my relic list that is particularly calling out to me that doesn't have a downside, because a lot of relics have downsides in certain books. Most don't. There are some books with very fantastic relics, like Caradrons. I use them as an example, because they're actually an army I've got right now and I'm putting together. Yeah, so they're all rather nice. But going to that, I'm not. So you're not going to see that as much anymore in competitive play. There's no more just people. I guess it is going to give the incentive to take, you know, things from your own relics. It's a bit of a shame because the Malign Sorcery stuff is reprinted in the game book and is very good, very powerful. Some of it's nice and interesting, but there are just obvious ones in there that are like, these are generic ones that anyone can take, and they're just better than most relics. So it's a shame that they're gone, but they're gone for balance, and I think it'll affect a lot of competitive lists that were using a lot of those relics just to increase efficiency, just that tidbit more than anything in their own books. But overall, I'm not going to put my 2 cents into how I think they're going to affect match play tournaments coming up yet. I'll be interested in watching what tournament results are and how people who used to run certain lists run them now with that. So Endless Spells have been capped at taking 3 in match play. Bit of shame for anyone who wanted to spam Endless Spells. Take a list that's nothing but Nagash, 3 units of skeletons, and then everything else being mortal wound spamming Endless Spells. People who wanted to use Seraphon to just spam out bound Endless Spells. No more of that. You're capped at 3, so pick wisely. There's no more multiple sources of ignoring damage. It used to be in Age of Sigmar that if you had multiple sources of ignoring damage, you'd do them all. So, for example, a Terrorgeist, a Ghoul King on Terrorgeist could ignore damage on a 6 from the Death trait, the generic one that they have. And then he could take a command trait in a particular build that would then let him ignore on a 5-up. And so what would happen is you'd hit him, he'd get his 4-up save, then he'd get his 6-up to ignore damage, then he'd get his 5-up to ignore damage. Now, under the new rules, it's just like 40k. He only gets one of those, so it's going to be instead the 4-up armor save and then the 5-up to ignore damage. So that will help a little bit, especially, but it's a bit of a nerf to death factions, which are really the factions that pile on the different ways to ignore damage depending on your build. So there's that. It affects a few others a little bit, but it just means there's less rolling to reduce damage, which means there's less durability, so you're getting back to that balance that Age of Sigmar has with things are dying. So make use of them before they die. The match play scenarios, I had a chance to look through them. They've some stuff that stood out to me is that they've very much been cleaned up and made far less gimmicky than they were before. Some of them are very much gone, and the ones that exist have been made a fair bit fairer. A lot of the really annoying things like relocation, orb are just flat out gone. Things that pretty much punished you if your army basically didn't have any of this particular kind of unit in your list, and thus you were really almost incapable of scoring points, and thus you were reduced to just killing everything because you couldn't even hold objectives. Those are gone and been, well, they're not gone, they've been changed so that they just are easier to get, so that all factions, no matter how you build your list, can now use that. You can now score objectives. A nice one being, which one is it? It's here. There's objectives, and it used to be that only wizards and monsters could score those objectives. Now it's just leaders, anything with the leader role, so any of your heroes. So, much better in case you don't have heroes or wizards and monsters. And then you've got the auxiliary objectives, which, in my opinion, are a waste of space. They're a complete waste of a great idea. They should have introduced them like they did the 40k 9th edition. Secondary objectives, they would have been much better, would have had much more of an impact. As they currently stand, you're just going to forget about them. You're going to pick them and forget because they just don't matter. They'll matter 1 in every 10 games. There's literally, I looked through it, in terms of games where they actually matter, like, they only come into it when you get a draw, right? So, that means, like, there's games where there's going to be a draw. There's not many of them. Like, you might get Star Strike, Battle for the Past might end in a draw if both you and your opponent go bad. It'll come up most of the time in Knife to the Heart, because that's a hard one to do, because that one is just if you control the opponent's objective at the end of the 3rd battle round, you automatically win. No points, no nothing. It's like the only one where they're going to come up, because it can often be a case of 2 well-built armies and 2 smart players that are going at it, and this can be a case of, well, it's battle round 3, we still control these, we reach battle round 5, literally neither of us have anything left to get to each other's objectives. Okay, auxiliary objectives. That's the only time it's going to matter, which is a bloody waste, and I fracking hate it, because anyway. So, and that's it. That's all that the General's Handbook and the FAQs have brought us. I went through all the FAQs. There wasn't a whole lot else that stood out. Just a few bits and bobs. There wasn't even that much erratas or designers' commentary for a lot of factions. It was very much just, here's the points, and here's 1 or 2 erratas for some of the most broken factions and broken hyphenated finger marks. Some of the factions that we wrote these rules and they were better than probably what we intended, and ended up just being spammed by everyone that went to tournaments. So that's about it. Overall, I like it. 2020's delivered a fairer playing field going forward, so that whatever comes out next, like when our dear boys, the Haitian Elves, Lumineth Realm Lords, get released, like clearly they're going to be something that once again changes the meta. So I suspect a lot of this was done to basically make sure that they're not in a bad place, or at least not in too good a place, just to let everyone else play to the objectives a bit better, not let Techless just crap out endless spells everywhere and make everyone rage and flip tables, because he's a beast. So yeah, and we'll see what happens with, and I actually suspect, depending on how the Sons of Behemoth go and how they are, and I severely got my trepidations about them. I don't want them to be Imperial Knights, which basically ruined 40k, but I also don't want them to be absolutely useless like some monsters are. So we'll see what they do. On the other hand, I also don't want them to be like ogres, who are just steamroll you. And I suspect some of the changes that I've read here, depending on how they do it, to how scoring objectives works for some games, such as the ones that just require, friendly leaders to be within it as the battlefield role. I suspect they've made those changes to accommodate the Sons of Behemoth, people who want to run just those giants as a single army, rather than, because they've previewed that you can include them in any army, which is going to be interesting. And God, I hope they're not like Imperial Knights. Fuck, I hate Imperial Knights. Anyway, I have been Jay from Jade Productions, and I will see you next time in our next video covering more Age of Sigmar role-playing stuff. I'm currently waiting on some books. I'm working on Sylvaneth and Ogres for the next Get Starting, so stay tuned for that. If you have any requests for things you want me to go through in more detail, leave them in the comments below. Any questions, leave them in the comments below. Anything you want to add to this discussion that I've missed or that I've overlooked, please put that in the comments below. And then I will see you next time. Stay safe. Happy wargaming. I've been Jay. Adios.